Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, Curator Kevin Adkisson, and today we are back in the Cranbrook Archives reading room, but we will not be talking about the archives so much as we will be discussing the late, great Harry Bertoia. And this screen is part of the Cranbrook collection of cultural properties, and I'll tell its story a little bit later during this Live at 5. But first, by way of introduction, who was Harry Bertoia? He's probably a name that you know if you are familiar with Cranbrook or if you're familiar with modern furniture, and I have pulled out a recent publication about Bertoia to give us some illustrations. Of course, Live at 5s aren't meant to be full-time lectures, so I don't have, the whole slideshow. But we are talking about this gentleman here, pictured in Detroit in the early 1930s. This is from a brand new book by Beverly Twitchell on Bertoia, which is pretty much required reading, required ownership if you are a big Bertoia fan or if you are a fan of mid-century design and of Cranbrook. So Harry Bertoia was born in Italy, in the south of Italy, in a little town called San Lorenzo. And he immigrated with his family to Detroit at the age of 15. He spoke no English, and so he had to learn English, and then he enrolled at Cass Technical High School, one of many important alumni from Detroit's probably most famous tech high school. And Bertoia studied at Cass Tech, and then his big artistic break came in 1937, when he was given a scholarship to come here to Cranbrook. While at Cranbrook, he already had skills in metalsmithing from Cass Tech, and so he used those to help reopen the silver shop that had been closed for a number of years because of the Great Depression. So after Arthur Neville Kirk was released in 1933, the silversmithing shop had been closed, and Harry Bertoia reopened it, first to make designs from Eliel Saarinen. So we have some silver pieces, a tea bowl, and a sugar piece in Saarinen's design and Harry's hand. But later he would make his own pieces, and I was actually just preparing for my first History of Architecture lecture last night, and I came across a George Booth quote where he was talking about this new hit student at Cranbrook, Harry Bertoia, and how exquisitely beautiful the artist's work was. And it's even reflected in some of the catalogs for early shows at Cranbrook in the late 1930s, where he's almost given his own section as Harry Bertoia silversmith. Now, from there, and maybe on a later Live at 5, I'll go upstairs here at the Art Museum and pull out some of those silver pieces. But today, I want to talk about something that seems very far away from a teapot, which is this more architectural sculpture by Harry Bertoia. And so how did a Italian immigrant trained in fine silversmithery who made a name for himself making teapots and vases and pitchers end up doing really quite exquisite modern sculpture like this? Well, after he left Cranbrook in the mid-1940s, he headed out to California, and he was studying at Santa Monica City College, or he was teaching there when he learned to weld. And so his work became bigger. Soldering and welding is a very different technique than chasing silver and working fine silver. And so this piece is a welded steel sculpture. And it's part of a whole series of screens that he started making in the 1950s. And the very first screen he made was actually done when he lived in Oakland County with his family, and he designed it for Eero Saarinen at the General Motors Technical Center in the cafeteria there. And so he was designing that for Eero Saarinen at GM, and he, pulled out a picture of that first screen. And he would work on the back of his barn at his house. So here he is seen at home. And he would actually adjust the sculptures. He would adjust these planes back and forth based on how daylight hit them. And he was interested in his sculptures and how they transformed from morning, noon, and night, and how they would change over time with the interaction of sunlight and metal. And here we see the first architectural screen installed, and he saw this and he was sort of horrified because this is a wall of all glass windows on the other side, and he thought the room was too big in Eero Saarinen's design already, and that his screen just made it darker. And all those studies that he had done about the sunlight hitting it, he realized it was sort of a moot point because sunlight never came this far into the building. And so as he went on in his career, designing a bank teller screen for Gordon Bunshaft in New York, he also got more involved in the architectural planning of where his pieces would be, coming to a sort of magnum opus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the MIT chapel, where his screen is underneath Eero Saarinen's great skylight. Now, he put screens in Yamasaki buildings and Saarinen buildings, here for Victor Gruen at the very first enclosed shopping mall ever built. But he also made them independent of architectural works. And so our screen is one of these that was always meant as sort of pure sculpture and would have been sold to, make money, and certainly was probably a higher profit margin, but also just an easier task to create a screen like this that was not site specific versus those early architectural commissions. Now, around this same time, he was also making chairs like the famous Knoll Diamond chair, which is, comes in different heights and different arms and upholstered and not upholstered. And so that is a welded metal rod chair. And if you can picture that, the diamond chair, and then you see these rods, you see his increasing interest in using sort of basic metal shapes. So the altered rod from the manufacturer could be made into a chair. It could also be made into a sculpture. Now, the finish of this is really quite interesting. It looks a little bit more orange in the screen than it is in real life. It's very golden. Maybe if I sit up next to it and look this way, that's a truer color, true to life. And what this is, it's not actually gold leaf. This is brass and copper melt coating the steel. And so he would use, again, thinking of his interest in rods and how sort of rods from production, the sort of base material, instead of his days as a fine silversmith where you would take sheet silver and then hammer it into a shape, he's thinking about how can I use the product in its sort of production state. And so what he would do is he would take brass and copper rods and he would melt them down with his torch. And he would use his torch almost like a painter's brush or a sculptor's hammer. And so he would heat up these metals onto the steel sculpture. And that is what creates this wonderful pooling effect. And he was always interested in how the process would create these swirls across the metal that come from the melting of two metals onto a third metal. And then how these swirls and patterns would catch the light. And you can see as I move across it, the variety of effects that these different swirls could have, or that this one technique of the torch could create. It's really quite exquisite. And then when it gets to the sort of architecture of the piece, it has this really wonderful sort of honeycomb-like web to it, where all of the fins are providing the vertical elements, but do you notice none of the rods are placed vertically? I think that's a pretty elegant solution. So instead of starting with a 53-inch high steel bar and then building the piece off of it, all of these fins that have the copper brass melt on them are connected, are the vertical structure, and then the steel rods provide the horizontal structure. And so as you walk around the piece, it becomes obviously much lighter visually on this side than it does when they all begin to line up and it becomes a much more solid screen. So it's pretty wonderful, and I love the balance. It really is quite painterly. If you think about painting at the same time, so this screen is 1953, and you think about painters like Wally Mitchell or other sort of these formal color field or colorist painters, and how they would use sort of lozenges and trapezoids. He's really using the steel bars in the same way. So it feels, like there is an overriding order to it, but then each of the angles are slightly different. It's not a true honeycomb pattern. It's a sort of warped pattern throughout. And the whole piece rests on 4 legs down at the bottom, and those are a slightly larger steel stock. I keep saying that the piece is steel and brass coated. I don't wonder if the rods are not just brass rods, and our record is slightly oversimplified. His daughter, Celia, helped us evaluate this piece when we acquired it in 2017, and she is the one who sort of identified the materials used, but I'm wondering if, in fact, the rods aren't brass rods, because it doesn't quite make sense to me why he would fabricate those in steel and then coat them. Now, how in the world did we get this piece in the reading room of Cranbrook Archives, and why were we acquiring a Bertoia in 2017 when we already have a fairly excellent examples of his works? Well, this piece was actually collected in Santa Barbara, California in the late 90s or early 2000s by a collector who was usually favored more Spanish art and sort of continental antiques, but who had an interest in Cranbrook and an interest in modernism from his parents, and that was Mr. Robert Smith. And so little Bobby Smith, whose parents, Sarah and Melvin, built the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House in Bloomfield Township, he collected this piece, and he had it in California, and then he decided that it actually belonged and fit better in his mother's house. And so he ended up moving the piece from where he and his mom lived in California back to the family home in Bloomfield Township. And so when Cranbrook was generously given the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House in 2017, we accessioned the house and all of its objects, or we accepted the house and all of its objects with sort of, the house was appraised. Anne Smith Tobes, the daughter-in-law, Bobby's widow, she said, everything in that house is part of the artistic story. Everything needs to stay there. What I realized as the first curator of the house, as I went into the process of transforming the Smith House from a family home that had not been lived in full-time by the family for some 25 years, but a family home nonetheless, into a museum, I began to research every single object. It had already been cataloged by my predecessor, and so I was researching more about where did it used to sit and where would it best go, because through things like a new roof and structural work and new drainage and new equipment, artworks would be moved from shelf to shelf, and I wanted to get them back to where they were in the mid-70s. And I really struggled with this piece because it never showed up in any pictures, and I couldn't figure out, A, how did the Smiths afford the Bertoia screen? Because, no offense, the Smith House was a dream house, but they built that thing on a penny and a prayer. And so this would have been valuable in the 1950s. It certainly would have been extraordinarily valuable in the 1970s, which is when they collected some of their bigger pieces. And it seemed strange to me that they could have bought this piece, and it didn't appear in Sarah Smith's biography, it didn't appear in the records, and it wasn't in any photographs. And so that is when I reached out to Ann Smith Tobes and her daughter Jennifer, and we put together that it actually came from Bobby and not from Melvin and Sarah. And so at that point, I called every single gallery in Santa Barbara and the greater Santa Barbara area looking for records of this sale. Unfortunately, though I did meet most of Bobby's art dealers, no one had a record. So if you sold this to the Smith family in the 90s, please reach out. But I did make the decision that it should come out of the house because I am trying to tell the story there of Frank Lloyd Wright, Melvin and Sarah Smith, and the artists that they collected for the house. And this piece doesn't really fit into that narrative, and it's also quite large in that very small house. And so in one of the most nerve-wracking journeys of my life, my colleague Leslie Mayo and I wrapped the piece in a moving blanket after doing some investigations and working with Celia Bertoia and an art handler about whether or not we could damage the piece, which in the end we realized we couldn't because it is that copper melt technique. And so the metal, it's not like gold leaf where we really could knock gold leaf off with our hands. This is not going to be damaged. So we carefully wrapped the entire piece up in a blanket, put it in the back of Leslie's Ford Explorer, and then drove very slowly from the Smith House to the Art Museum. And because it is part of the Smith House and collection, it's a cultural property, it's not an art museum object, we made the decision that we would display it here in the window of the reading room, which this reading room was opening at that same time. This had previously been a conference room. We were upstairs, and so this piece moved into this room, and Greg Whitcop, the center director, who was the art museum director when this building was built, actually designed this window frame to hold something like 800 pounds, because there is a Wayland Gregory sculpture from the 1939 World's Fair that Greg Whitcop thought he would display in this window. And so it is nice, I think, that even when the archives are closed and the window shade is drawn, any visitor to Cranbrook, especially on those summer weekends where this parking lot is absolutely filled, the visitor can look in and through the window, whether the building's open or not, can appreciate this great work from a distinguished Cranbrook alumni. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I was working with Laura McNewman, our archivist, earlier today, asking what we had in the archives about Harry Bertoia. His records are at the Bertoia Foundation and a few other places, so they are not at Cranbrook. We're getting some patina up here, which probably came from both time, but also being in the Smith House without any climate control. But I think it only adds to the beauty of the piece. So Laura and I couldn't find anything that was super rare or unusual about Mr. Bertoia, but I did like this one thing that we pulled out from a 1957 exhibit of Harry Bertoia's work, which is just the list of sculptures from the Smithsonian Institution, which we're helping to organize the piece. And, as a curator, I deal with these types of forms a lot, but mine are always object records from the museum system, which is our computer program. And so a modern object list would have a digital photograph and then word processor. But I love here that the curator has not only given the dimensions, the weight, and a description, but he or she has also drawn little pictures of all of the Bertoia sculptures that were in this 1957 show from the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibit Services, recent work by Harry Bertoia. And so I think you can see that this one, though it's 3 inches taller than mine, it's part of a series that he did. Of course, Cranbrook has had multiple Bertoia shows. This is a lovely little exhibition pamphlet designed likely by Catherine McCoy, just based on the looks of it. So this was 1980 that this show was held here at Cranbrook. And again, if you want to learn more about Harry Bertoia, there's a quite a bit online about him. I mean, he is one of the great American sculptors, furniture makers, and silversmiths. But everything on the internet cannot compare to this new 2019 or 2018 compendium. The complete works are, I'm not sure if they consider it the complete works, but it certainly tells the full Bertoia story, including these prototypes for a chaise lounge from the Diamond series by Knoll. So thanks so much for joining this live at 5. I'll show you the cover of the book so that when you go to your local bookseller, you can make sure they're ordering the right one. I will be back tomorrow from the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House talking again about Melissa Webb's sculpture over there. And then I'll be back next Tuesday for another live at 5 on Instagram. Thanks so much, everyone who came to my first History of American Architecture lecture last night. It was a success, talking about Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Alvar Aalto's trip to Cranbrook in the 1930s. Next week, I will be talking again about James Wine's, Louis Kahn, and Minoru Yamasaki's trips to Cranbrook, and sort of where American architecture was in the 60s and 70s. If you want to sign up for the lecture series yet, you are more than welcome to at center.cranbrook.edu. I can send you a link to last night's lecture, and then you can start on next Monday live at 11 a.m. or live at 7 p.m. I just had a 2-hour conversation with James Wines about his architecture and about Cranbrook, and I'm full of stories and excitement for next week's lecture. So make sure to check that out. You help support the center, you help support me, and you get to look at beautiful pictures for 75 minutes. What could be better? Thanks so much for joining us for another Live at 5. I'm Kevin Adkisson with the Center for Collections and Research, closing out our little discussion of Harry Bertoia's Little Screen. And goodbye.